To take our seats.
They're turning it on. There you go.
Get ourselves settled. Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Michelle Stevens. I am the founding and executive director for the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. I'm a faculty member here at Rutgers, New Brunswick, in English and Latino and Caribbean Studies. Welcome to those of you here in the room. Welcome to those of you online. We have the pleasure of hearing from my esteemed colleague and wonderful friend, Enobong Anna Branch, who will be talking about her book this evening that has just been published. And so she will be kicking off and launching that book here with us. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about her first, turn the floor over to her, and then give us some time at the end for question and answer. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Branch. So Dr. Branch is the Senior Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Rutgers University, and she provides strategic leadership to ensure that the institutional commitment to equity is reflected in the research, educational, and public engagement efforts that occur throughout the university and extend their focus to faculty, staff, and students. Many of us here, many of you online, may know her in that capacity. We are getting the thrill this evening of experiencing her in her very, equivalent, and we don't know how she does it, but happening all at the same time, capacity as a scholar. She leads the University and Inclusion Office and the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement on the New Brunswick campus. She champions the role of diversity and inclusion in achieving excellence and strengthening the institutional commitment to Rutgers' diverse communities on and off campus. And she's doing that championing, I can attest to that, literally every minute, right? Beyond every day, every minute, right? Prior to joining Rutgers, Dr. Branch served as Associate Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her significant accomplishments in that role include leading the integration of diversity throughout the campus strategic plan, executing the university's campus climate survey, creating diversity infrastructure through climate advisors in executive areas and diversity officers in schools and colleges, and leading the National Science Foundation-funded advanced program pursuing innovative organizational change strategies to spur institutional transformation and support racial and gender equity in the faculty ranks. And if there's something that sums all of that up, it's something that I learned from Dr. Branch very, very early in her time here, that diversity and success in diversity is really about organizational excellence. And that in and of itself right there, her history shows you how she came to that very important insight. A professor of sociology, Dr. Branch's commitment to advancing equity extends to academic research on labor and work, some of which we will hear more about today, that explores the historical roots and contemporary underpinnings of racial and gender inequality. She's the co-author of Black in America, The Paradox of the Color Line, published in 2020, the editor of Pathways, Potholes, and the Persistence of Women in Science, Reconsidering the Pipeline, published in 2016, and the author of Opportunity Denied, Limiting Black Women to Devalued Work, published in 2011. So none of those are actually the next book that we're here to talk about today, right? A sought-after national expert on diversity in the academy, she serves on several advisory boards, aims to advance inclusive excellence within professional societies, national academies. I could go on, there's more. My pleasure is that she's also my partner and co-PI on a wonderfully exciting project we've been working on together called Black Bodies, Black Health, supported by a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so that has been, and some of that I think she may also mention today. So with that said, I'm gonna welcome her family who is here to support her and invite her to come to the floor, and let's welcome her to tell us about her work.
Thank you all for braving this weather to be here this afternoon. I cannot be more excited to be here. But before I begin, I want to start with some thanks. Because you don't do a project like this for as long as I've been working on this particular project, almost 7 years, without a lot of people. But in particular, tonight, events like this don't get pulled off without some very important people. So first, I want to thank the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice team, Michelle, who you just heard from, Tanya, who you will see kind of in the corner over there, Robin Yarborough, who's not in the room, but behind the scenes helps make lots of magic happen. So thank you to that team. Thank you to the Rutgers IU TV team. So for those of you, the ITV team, those of you who are joining us online, their stewardship and skill make that possible. So thank you to the ITV team. And thank you to the UBI team. So University Equity and Inclusion is a team that I have the privilege of leading, and I work with wonderful people every day who help me manage the mayhem, as I call it. So thank you to Stephanie Smith, Jason Brandon, Jessica Zura, Lajanice Harris, and Joan Collier, in particular, for lots of the little things that they did in between, including convincing me to do this in the first place. So, thank you for that. Thanks to my family for being here in the front row, who you don't see often, but doing my job, both of them, as I call it. I call my day job applied sociology, and my other job, kind of writing books. Writing is what keeps me sane, and so I do it a lot, and so they bear with me, so thank you for that. And finally, special thanks to my co-author. I wrote this book with a colleague and dear friend, Carolyn Hanley, who we've been working together for almost 15 years now, and it's been a really long and amazing, fruitful partnership. And then my research assistant, Candace King, who many of you have met because she came to Rutgers when I first came here, who's with us online on the live stream. Both of them made it possible to complete this book. And they made it infinitely richer for their insights. And so I am deeply grateful to them, and you're going to hear a little bit of their thoughts in this. And so I want to kick this off with talking to you about the Black Bodies and Black Health Project. And so what is that? In this talk, I'm going to be talking about its work in black and white, imagining a just racial future. But it's sponsored by the Black Bodies, Black Health Project, again, through the Institute of the Study of Global Racial Justice, which I have the co-pleasure of leading with the founding executive director, Michelle Stevens. And this project centers humanistic and social scientific fields to identify strategies needed to disrupt structural racism as a determinant of health and well-being. Our goal was to help the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation understand how we came to a point where white bodies are naturalized and black bodies are invisible, and what are the consequences of representation, and more importantly, what the foundation could do to more intentionally create a different and more just future. And we posed a few big questions. What would a just future require? To remediate the imprints of the past in the structures of our present. What must we disrupt to achieve health equity? These meaty questions are not the purview of a single discipline, but require the marriage and purposeful intersection of fields and scholarly breadth. We center Black bodies and Black health precisely because Blackness and the African body were central to the inception of race, and so therefore they must also be central to its disruption. The Black Bodies, Black Health Project funded seed grants supporting humanists, social scientists, and biomedical researchers across 4 clusters: Black bodies, the carceral state, physician education, and environmental racism, to explore, unpack, and disrupt structural racism in service of creating equitable health outcomes. I want to focus in on today's talk on the Black body. A 2020 ProPublica analysis sought to understand why COVID-19 killed so many young Black men. The authors, Akila Johnson and Nina Martin, argue, to understand why, you have to know the legend of John Henry and the silent but deadly cost of striving. As the legend goes, and you'll see on the screen, John Henry was a steel-driving man who defeated a steam-powered drill and died with a hammer in his hand. The folktale celebrates one man's victory against seemingly insurmountable odds, but it holds another harsher truth. His determination and strength are also what killed him. The John Henry of contemporary social theory is a man striving to get ahead in an unequal society. The effort of confronting that machine, day in and day out, compounded over a lifetime, leads to stress so corrosive that it physically changes bodies, causing Black men to age quicker, become sicker, and die younger than nearly any other United States demographic group. COVID-19, they argue, is a new gear in an old machine. We open our book, Work in Black and White, Striving for the American Dream, with this sentiment. The COVID-19 pandemic laid bare the inequality of the American labor market. As the economy contracted and unemployment soared in the spring of 2020, commentators noted the disparity in who was still going to work. Black and brown employees were disproportionately represented in occupations that were traditionally devalued, but were newly considered essential. These jobs were characterized by low wages and uncertainty. Though some jobs could be considered full-time, almost none paid a living wage. The jobs that enabled some Americans to stay at home required the exposure and vulnerability of other Americans, and that divide fell often along racial lines. According to one estimate, 80% of Black Americans worked in jobs that could not be performed from home. For the first time in recent history, Americans were forced to see what had previously been rendered invisible: the racial fractures of the labor market. While Black poverty and urban inequality has historically been framed as the result of individual choices and the lack of personal responsibility, the world watched as largely Black and brown workers stood close together on subway platforms, trains, and buses in New York City, unable to observe social distancing as they headed to work. We witnessed the resulting impact of this exposure: mounting fatalities in poorer communities as those workers returned home and brought COVID-19 with them. Nationwide, Black Americans make up 12.4% of the population, but they made up 21.5% of COVID-19 deaths in April 2020. Although comorbidities were a factor, this disparity had everything to do with labor market inequality. If under the most hazardous conditions, Black Americans risked it all by continuing to work, perhaps the United States is finally ready to collectively grapple with the fact that Black poverty was never about individual choices and personal responsibility. Furthermore, even as it laid bare the deep racial inequalities in the labor market, the pandemic also crushed job opportunities for white Americans who found themselves in a labor market with unemployment reaching Great Depression levels. It's time we recognize the fact that personal effort alone is insufficient to improve one's occupational or financial situation in the face of vast structural limitations to opportunity. We focus on Black and white workers because the American labor market story is predominantly a Black-white story. As you can see in Figure 1, in both 1960 and 1970, over 95% of the American labor force was either non-Hispanic Black or non-Hispanic white. By 1980, the non-Hispanic Black and white share of the American labor force was 92.1%. Asian and Asian American, Hispanic and Latina, and American Indian, Alaskan Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander workers represented larger portions of regional American labor markets in the post-war period and before, but together, they did not comprise more than 10% of the overall national labor market. In 2015, non-Hispanic Black and white workers comprised 75% of the American labor market. We focus on Black men, Black women, and white women because despite formal prohibitions against discrimination, racism expressed through the racial preferences of employers in allocating workers to jobs remains a stubborn obstacle for Black workers. To understand why, we need to unpack the Black-white binary. The sociologist, Charles Tilly, urges the study of categorical inequalities that do not fluctuate, change, or disappear in social relations and interactions. Black and white labor market inequality deserves special attention because of its durability, its persistence over whole careers, lifetimes, and organizational histories. The power of what Tilly calls bounded categories, such as Black or white, male and female, lies in the aura of naturalness they take on for most casual observers. They become almost invisible as causal factors shaping opportunity. Yet, bounded categories are sharply recognized in the resulting economic inequality. The now you see it, now you don't nature of bounded categories enables them to do important work in the maintenance of hierarchies. Not all categories are created equal. In a country whose economic foundations were determined according to the principles of white supremacy and male privilege, bounded categories such as Black and white and male-female were imbued with power and reinforced by social stratification systems such as slavery and patriarchy that lead to economic inequality. Today, despite the enduring nature of these categorical inequalities, the differences that persist between these groups is often attributed to individual variation in talent and effort. For example, we often hear the familiar story that if Black Americans took personal responsibility, the economic conditions of Black communities in the United States would improve. A story that ignores the fact that opportunities for white workers were historically defined by the exclusion of Black workers. Despite this deep reality of inequality historically, the post-World War II period holds an almost mythical position in conversations about the American dream. It's popularly remembered as a time of high living standards, low inequality, and widespread opportunity. But as historian Stephanie Coons observed in her post-war family life in her book, The Way We Never Were, American Families and Nostalgia Trap, the post-war American labor market of our collective memory does not fully align with reality. And yet, the illusion lives on. Equal opportunity has never been the reality in the United States. Then as now, some people are much better off than others. This privilege and opportunity was the case not just for the super rich or the 1% as they are sometimes described today, but also for regular folks, like Joe, who had a union job at the plant, versus Jason, who did not. Neither Joe nor Jason had more than a high school education, and both worked hard. Yet the fruits of their labor were uneven, because Joe was white and Jason was Black. Race similarly structured the occupational options of Jane and Jeanette, though their options were further limited by gender. Race dictated that for Jane, a white woman, her place would be in the home upon marriage, and she would be only temporarily engaged in the labor market prior to that. Similarly, race dictated for Jeanette, a Black woman, that she would be obliged to work, whether she was married and had children or not. The constraints on Joe, Jason, Jane, and Jeanette, fictional characters, reflected the role of race and gender as central organizing features of the American labor market. Today, large swaths of the American population understand economic insecurity in opposition to this nostalgic and romanticized view of the post-war period. Such a view, however, does not capture the lived experiences of large percentages of the American workforce during that time, specifically workers who were not white men. The Pre-Civil Rights Act labor market was one of intense racial and ethnic division, with the preservation of labor market privilege for a few by a myriad of means, both violent and direct, such as Negroes need not apply. In the post-war period of low inequality and high average wages, there were clear industrial and occupational divisions that separated workers by race and gender. In short, white men were concentrated in core industries and primary occupations that promised economic security in the form of high wages and benefits, job security, and opportunities for advancement. White women, Black men, and Black women were concentrated in less secure industries and occupations. Labor market position, indicated by the four occupational industrial groups shown, well summarized both the employment quality and race-gender inequalities in access to those good jobs. But something changed. In the post-war economy, occupation and industrial grouping provided a reliable indication of secure work, even though it was limited. In the post-industrial period, even the most highly skilled occupational groups no longer delivered uniform economic security for several reasons. There was no longer a primary or secondary labor market. Skilled, biased technological change started to structure who had access to good jobs. That's why education became so important. Manufacturing and unionization declined because manufacturing was tied to the good jobs of American memory. The service sector grew rapidly on the low and on the high end, and there was a dramatic increase in part-time work. I enjoy this cartoon because it is a tragic statement of a reality, right? The US economy, and to make the point, on the plus side of the crash, it seems we have hit bottom. One of the tragedies of the American labor market is cyclical recessions, because we keep thinking we've hit bottom, and then we discover a new one. One of the most important changes in the post-industrial American labor market has been rising levels of earnings and income inequality. During this period, annual earnings trends highlight a growing advantage to those at the top, but stagnation or decline to everyone else. This is particularly visible when we look at trends in inflation-adjusted earnings percentiles. Figure 1.5 here shows that from 1960 to 1970, the last decade of the post-war period, a rising tide continued to lift all boats. Earnings at the 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles grew. After 1970, however, earnings growth is increasingly reserved for the top 25% of earners, those whose annual earnings or total take-home pay from their main job place them at or above the 75th percentile, while everyone else is treading water. Yet, achieving job security and the ability to gain access to a good job is what made belief in the American dream plausible. We pose a lot of different questions in the research in the book, but the one I want to highlight today is, given the way things are in America, given this backdrop, how do Black and white Americans who are questioning whether their families have a good chance of improving their standard of living grapple with belief in the American dream? How do they cope when their circumstances don't match their efforts? So a quick review of the data that we used. There were 79, we conducted a mixed race interviewing team with race-matched interviews. So white interviewers with white participants, Black interviewers with Black participants, conducted 79 semi-structured interviews. 23 Black women, 19 white women, 20 Black men, and 17 white men. And the interviews ranged from 1.5 to 3.5 hours. Our participants were roughly ages 35 to 55, and we were especially interested in educated workers, and I'll tell you more about why in a moment, ranging from a minimum of some college all the way through terminal degrees, such as JD, PhDs, and MDs. The interviews were conducted in a medium-sized city in New England in a diversified economy, so not relying on a single sector. And the population was diverse. It was a diverse urban center with more segregated suburbs, as is typical of American society. And participants had a minimum household income of at least $30,000. Most were much higher. Some exceeded $200,000. So that's a backdrop. That's who we were talking to. But I want to tell you a little bit about why. We described the sample that we identified as a pivotal generation. We call them the vanishing middle. And it's because, given the investments that this group of people had made, had the economy stayed on the tracks of where it was in the 60s and 70s, those people would have been solidly middle class, right? That's what they were aspiring for. And the economy shifted. And so these workers are workers who had a really strong conception of what their lives would be, and they have a reflection of what happened as a result. In part, it's because the structures of economic opportunity began to change right as they were entering the labor market in the 70s and the 80s, leading to increased economic insecurity that complicated their ability to obtain the fruits of their labor. Our participants were raised in households, as I was showing you in some of the earlier photos, whose economic fortunes were shaped by an era of economic opportunity, the post-war period, but came of working age in another, the post-industrial period. And men and women, again, going back to some of the earlier photos I was showing, were more likely or not to be remarried or divorced in that age range, and were able to reflect on how experiences with stable or unstable employment affected their identities and their intimate relationships. For all workers today, obtaining job security is more often an ideal than a reality. But there are notable differences in how Black and white Americans grapple with this change in job security. The way people interpret their current opportunities in the labor market, or the lack thereof, is directly tied to their racial group's historical inclusion or exclusion from the American cultural imagination, and their historical access to the means of achieving the American dream, a good job. The economic and the cultural tenets of the dream are familiar, and we found largely racially universal. So I'm going to take you through a series of quotes. And here I want to introduce you to Henry. Henry's a 54-year-old Black technical writer, and he captured the basic tenets of the American dream well in his interview. He said, "The American dream, in my opinion, is to get an education, get a good job that pays a lot of money, buy a house, have 2.5 kids and a dog with a white picket fence and 2 cars in the driveway. That's the American dream." Both Black and white Americans today aspire to this vision of the dream. As they increasingly struggle in the face of widespread job insecurity, however, they diverge in their opinions about what's getting in the way of achieving it. One important divergence is that Black Americans, at far higher rates than white Americans, point to structural inequality as an obstacle to achieving the American dream. This critique was made by Black Americans from a variety of professional backgrounds. Meet Sean, a 51-year-old Black executive director of a nonprofit, and he draws a connection between the inequality that we see currently and the legacy of slavery. The history of this nation, he says, the racial structure of the nation, it's been set up so that, one group were able to come here and realize the American dream a little bit easier than others. Charles, a 39-year-old Black superintendent, focused his critique on the present day, but he came to a similar conclusion. How can the American dream be something true if we already know statistically everyone can obtain it for many different reasons? As mentioned, the critique of the structural limitations was predominantly made by Black workers, but a few white workers shared this view. Spencer, a 34-year-old white marketer, was one of the white participants who made this critique and made a connection between structure and opportunity. He said, "I think there's obvious barriers to the American dream. Most people will put it as a class issue, that the more money you make, the more privilege and opportunities you're going to have for your family and etc. I'll say that even if that's true, there are still other issues in the United States that disallow people from having the good life and that good job based on who they are, based on even their gender or their ethnicity." These critiques of the American dream, based on a view of structural inequality in highlighting how the dream has always been out of reach for some workers, stands in notable contrast to how many white Americans described the situation. They cited instead increased insecurity that they face today as the obstacle they face in achieving the American dream. That's to say, although most white Americans are doggedly pursuing the ideal of the American dream, they tend to simultaneously mourn the loss of the job security they had taken for granted. Black Americans, however, cannot mourn something they never had. Many white Americans' idea of the American dream takes for granted the fundamental and central assumption that hard work will yield a good job, secure work that pays a living wage. Although historically, insecurity has always been a lived reality for some Americans, particularly for vast numbers of Black Americans, enough white Americans were able to achieve a level of economic security to sustain their belief that those who do the right things, such as obtaining higher education or working in a particular occupational sector, can avoid hardship and insecurity. Yet economic shifts and eroding labor protections have obliterated this notion for increasing numbers of both Black and white Americans. Higher education is no longer a foolproof insurance policy against job insecurity, and that cuts across occupations and industries. This reality is being met by white Americans in particular with disbelief. Meet Claire. She's a 41-year-old white nurse, and she described with some incredulity her partner struggles to find employment. He has been employed, she said. He's an adjunct professor, so he was employed until mid-May, and now over the summer, he has no work. During his employment gap, she continued, he did a short-term grading gig in St. Louis, grading AP exams for 1 week, which is about as fun as it sounds. His discipline, Claire said, was history. And when asked about his level of education, she recounted with dismay, he's got a Ph.D. That someone with such an elite credential would be subject to short-term contract work suggests it isn't simply low-skilled workers and sectors that are affected, but high-skilled sectors as well. The disbelief evident in her remarks that someone with such an elite credential would be unable to find steady work reflects expectations about the security his credential would provide. Claire's comments in reflecting the expectation of some Americans of the American dream, the idea that it would work for them, revealed her understanding of the rise of insecurity in American society, particularly how she and those like her make sense of insecurity when it hits home. It reflects recent economic changes and broader societal changes that increasingly disconnect educational investments and labor market rewards in the United States, which have undermined the American dream. Her partner had experienced job insecurity amid recent economic changes, and that disconnect she found deeply troubling. For the reasons discussed earlier, however, there are divergent trends along racial lines in the expectations that the American dream would work. In the book, we explore how Americans, Black and white, men and women, are making shifts of this rising economic insecurity. For instance, Charles, who we met earlier, who argued that the American dream can't possibly be a reality given the statistical limitations and opportunity, continued in the same line of thinking. He called the dream BS and shared his thoughts about hard work and opportunity. I'm not going to tell my daughter that if you work hard, great things will happen for you. It's nonsense. If you work hard and do the right thing, you'll have better opportunities. That's a whole different storyline. Charles makes explicit his expectation that his daughter will struggle to find employment, even if she works hard. His understanding that hard work is only one part of the equation and no guarantee of security is in stark contrast to Claire's surprise regarding her partner's struggle to find work. Many Black Americans, like Charles, have perceptions of current employment conditions and prospects for improvement that have been affected by the decidedly limited occupational opportunities that Black Americans have faced in the United States forever. This means that, despite vast job insecurity, things may be looking up. For whites, such as Claire, the opposite is true. Despite being disadvantaged in the contemporary labor market, Black Americans see more reason for optimism today, for improving their lives in the current economic context than white Americans do. It's not just the difference between Claire and Charles. In 2013, the Associated Press National Opinion Research Center, AP-NORC, found in an analysis of the General Social Survey that the expressed optimism of an improved life for Black and white Americans was diverging, producing the largest racial gap observed since the survey began in 1972. Most Black Americans, 71%, compared to just 46% of white Americans, thought their family had a good chance of improving their living standard given the way things were in America, or are in America. While the rise of insecure work has made aspects of the American dream more difficult to achieve for all Americans, arguably driving perceptions of declining mobility for whites, the American dream has historically been out of reach for most racial minorities. Hence the optimism expressed by Black Americans despite the severity of the Great Recession and its aftermath. It reflects a comparison to a fundamentally different past. When our Black participants reflected on how things are in America, they perceived an uncertain occupational future, but one over which most believed they could exert some control. Many conceived of the structural inequalities they faced as a game that they could navigate by attaining a higher education, building relationships, adapting to cultural norms, and working hard. For Black Americans, despite having fewer overall job opportunities or opportunities for security than white Americans, the post-1970 labor market, however problematic, represents the first time that, as Jennifer Hochschild put it in her book, Race, Class, and the Soul of the Nation, Facing Up to the American Dream, the cultural components of the American dream and the economic means to achieve it even appear tenable. This era, with all of its problems, in other words, represents the first time in history that Black Americans can imagine applying to their lives former President Bill Clinton's memorable words: "If you work hard and play by the rules, you should be given the chance to go as far as your God-given ability will take you." The divergent levels of pessimism and optimism among Black and white Americans amid the broad economic insecurity of the current era reflect what we refer in the book as the racial futures paradox. We introduce this term to capture the complex objective and subjective components of economic insecurity and highlight the contradictions that are inherent in the empirical realities and the lived experiences of Black and white individuals who are simultaneously navigating unprecedented opportunity and insecure times. Examining economic insecurity for us through this kind of historical and race-gender lens helps us to understand why white and Black Americans seem to have different perceptions of the present and different levels of optimism for the future. And it helps to reshape contemporary debates over economic insecurity. It's really not a matter of how bad is it, it's what's your reference point. So what would it take to restore the dream? What would it take to restore some measure of security, in particular, to the promise of the dream? Because the dream is still out there. And our participants provided lots of ideas for what a just society could look like. They articulated a clear role for government in ensuring that all Americans can realistically aspire to the American dream, even as they emphasize the importance of personal responsibility. It's not either or. They all found common ground on the ideal of a meritocratic America, but opinions about how to get ahead in a meritocracy continue to diverge along racial lines, depending on how each participant understood their current and past access to opportunity. Black participants emphasized the need for more to be done to address the problems of unequal access, while white participants emphasized the need for more opportunities for all Americans, skirting the question of racial imbalance. Tony, a 48-year-old Black bus driver and paraprofessional educator, offered a vision of a just society. A just society should be what the promise of America was set up to be: an equal opportunity for every individual. Unfortunately, when they wrote that, every individual meant white and male. We have to broaden that scope to include everybody. As I close, I want to revisit John Henry. Akilah Johnson and Nina Martin write, "It wasn't just living in poverty that wore down Black men's bodies." Social epidemiologist, Sherman James, pictured here, hypothesized that their struggle to break out of poverty, that wasn't it. It wasn't just the inequality that made them sick, but the effort to be equal in a system that was fundamentally unjust. Dr. James introduced the John Henryism hypothesis to capture the cost of striving. It's the striving to make something of themselves, to live their lives with dignity and purpose, and to be successful against extraordinary circumstances, James said. They're trying to make a way out of no way. It's the Black American story. And there's a cost to all of it, not just for Black Americans, for all Americans, because we're working harder and harder to stay afloat. As the structural realities in the US labor market and the economy continue to shift, Americans' commitments to meritocracy means they're working harder and harder. The promise of the American dream is that hard work not only leads to opportunity, but also security. Yet as insecurity rises and workers hold tight to the cultural mythology pushing themselves to work harder, is fueling an invisible but highly consequential form of insecurity, bad health. As Black Americans in particular cling to the assurances of the American dream and grapple with the host of impediments to achieving it, they're literally dying in the process. There is no structural accountability in the dream, just the individual responsibility to work for it. As economic vulnerability defines our new normal, perhaps we can now realize the critical role of social supports for Americans going through tough times, and find the political will to make the invisible policy choices that create structures of opportunity. This is necessary not just in profound and disruptive crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, but in the ordinary and now routine labor force disruptions that characterize modern work in America. For as long as individuals are chasing security, hustling to demonstrate deservingness, and internalizing failure, the broad coalition needing to push for change and sustain it cannot be formed. Instead, Black and white Americans will chase the ever-elusive American dream while bemoaning the fact that it's not working for them. The reality is this: unless we redefine the American dream inclusively, creating the means to enable true economic freedom, not just aspirational opportunity, but the means to achieve it, we will not live up to the ideal, the promise, or the possibility of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to shift us over into Q&A and some discussion. So I'm going to move over here. And while everybody's kind of assimilating, everybody hearing me?
I think, is it on? There you go.
So while everybody's kind of taking that in and thinking about questions, I thought I would get us started. And so something that already immediately came to mind. Thank you. Well, first of all, again, brilliant. I want to give another. And so I want to pick right up with one of the things towards the end. That was one of the moments that I felt was brilliant. Yeah. So, you know, that link that you're making, I mean, there's already so much that you did in the first part of your talk and that you're doing in the book. Towards the end of your talk, the link that you made between structural insecurity and bad health, right? And you talked about the way in which, you know, there has to be a notion of the American dream that emphasizes inclusivity, right? Yeah. I agree, right? Yeah. But I wanted to back you up and ask you something about how willing or able are Americans to name the structural insecurity issue that you are naming? Because I feel like that is one of the brilliant moves of the book, is that you're naming something that no one wants to see.
Yeah, absolutely. If I tell you what my participants said, the answer is not really. You know, one of the interesting dynamics in the book, even for our Black participants who were the most willing to kind of grapple and could point to it, there was a tension between saying, I'm experiencing insecurity, but I worked for and deserve what I have. So there wasn't the ability to say, yes, there's structural limitations, and I deserve it. Like, both are true, right? In some ways, they experienced the naming of the structural as an out. So they had bought into the hype that is the kind of cultural mythology of the dream, right? That you can't name struggle. I ended with the picture that I was showing was an article from the Wall Street Journal about the American dream is alive and well, don't believe the populist type, right? That's the struggle, right? And that's the pressure, that's the power of the mythology, right? Is that when you struggle, it's you. The dream's there. Anybody who wants to reach it can get it. And so for the Black Americans who could name it, you heard them in the conversation struggling, even the successful ones, right? Being able to say, I see it, I name it, I can describe it, and you have to work for it. So you heard folks saying things like meritocracy and personal responsibility, but we've got to fix the structure, right? That difficulty of naming it is the difficulty.
Yes.
And so that reliance, I didn't talk about it as much in the talk, but in the book, one of the threads is how much emphasis is put on education. And that the reality is that education has become a stand-in for discomfort. right? It's a way to say, I've worked hard, look, I worked hard. And the reality that it's not working for people in the way they expected it to. And so I think in some ways, the failure of education to do the work we expect it to do is an opportunity.
One more follow-up. I know there are probably questions, but more follow-up. I feel like an older analysis of the class stratifications of the labor force would have stopped at the issue of struggle. Granted, this may be the psychoanalyst in me and the psychotherapist in me, but what I was so struck by is to identify insecurity, which people think of as a very individual feeling, as actually a structural feeling, and then to indicate where that leads us to in terms of health, right? It feels like there are some moves you're making there that maybe get us around what had been the central tension when I was in graduate school. Is it class versus race? I'm so tired of that discussion, right? So maybe you could say a little bit about how you and your co-author kind of tackled that old, is it class versus race, right?
One of the things that was really interesting in shaping this project, when we were recruiting participants, we told them it was the changing economy study, right? So we asked, like, we want to know how you feel about the economy. These interviews were conducted in the summer of 2015, which was a different economic moment, right? Post-recession, kind of, stable is a weird thing to describe, right? Because one of the reasons we focused on educated workers is that those with only a high school education were insecure long before now, right? So we're just kind of setting off to the side. But this group of workers are people who thought things would be better. So they were more reflective, and it wasn't as simple as, and this is also the group of workers for whom we have fictions of enlightenment. And what I mean by that is, the tropes of racism and inequality aren't driving them in the same way, right? So that's why I call it fictions of enlightenment. Because when you pushed people, when we asked them, given the way the economy was, and we led up to a certain set of questions, but then we asked, do you think there's a difference in opportunity for blacks and whites, right? How do you see that? How do you experience that? And we couched that in their own history. You saw people sidestep, evade, detect, and that question of what's happening here. What's the difficulty? You can name the insecurity, you can name the struggle, and as you set their narratives side by side and kind of listen to interviews, you're like, something weird. It's not as simple as, are you comfortable or not? Right, one of the big things in the book that I think is fascinating, I think the book's interesting, is for folks who have a good job, right? This is why it's not just are you class stable, but will you continue to be? So the angst that people were experiencing was, do I have a good job now? And rather than the good job providing security, it actually increased angst because a good job was something you could lose. Right? And so in the narratives, in the struggle, it actually made it much simpler. There was no such thing as class stability. To make it a race-class argument, class needs to be stable. Class is not. That's what people are living right now, right? The idea that even amongst high-income earners, they are a paycheck or two away from struggle. And so class as a concept isn't as rigid as the books of yesteryear, the truly disadvantaged, the urban poor. When we're talking about the urban poor, it's a completely different conversation. When you're trying to get a handle on how do educated Americans who live in suburbs, who identify as middle class, understand their class fragility, you realize how tenuous the whole conversation really is.
Thank you. All right, other questions, comments, reactions? Derek.
Anna, thank you for that brilliant talk. Absolutely brilliant. One of the last few slides you put up, I was struck by the gap between blacks and whites in terms of hopefulness about being able to achieve the American dream. You noted on the slide that the data was collected or at least put out in 2013. Now, of course, that's interesting because I wonder what impact Obama had on blacks' perceptions that they could get ahead. I think that he just beat Mitt Romney to and was going to go to a second term. So it'd be interesting to see what happened to that number, particularly with respect to black folk, before Obama and certainly after Obama. I suspect that number goes down. By how much, I'm not so sure. So how do you factor in that dimension to explaining that
Such
graphic?
a question. Thanks for posing it. So two things. In the book, we update the data, and it did go down. in the aftermath. One of the interesting things about that finding from AP Norc is it was the largest gap ever. So both groups were moving. That's the thing that's actually really important. It's not just that blacks were going up, it's that whites were going down. So both are moving at the same time. And so what the drivers were behind each group's movement is part of the story, right? Because this is a generation of workers who were able to be okay with minimal educational investments, who told their children, get an education. That's how you're gonna hold on to what you have, right? That's this generation of workers. And so as they think about the articles of the last 10 years, is a college education worth it? What degree to get? This whole conversation about the future is that everyone's trying to figure out, how do I shore up a future? And the answer is not clear, right? And so coming out of 2018, think about the post-2008 Occupy movement, and that there was the broader frustrations of the American public were, who can I blame? There wasn't a way to say and understand, there wasn't a formula. And I think when you look at the generation before, when this measure was clear, there was at least a sense that if you did these things, you'd be okay. And so that sensibility of, are you confident, given the way things are in America, that your future will be better? That pessimism for all workers, black and white, are saying, I don't know. I'm not confident. So this tension for black workers reflecting on their past is a really interesting thing. The other thing that's interesting, and part of why these interviews, because that was one of the motivations for the puzzle that we were trying to figure out, is that we did these interviews the summer of 2015 before Donald Trump became the Republican presidential nominee, but after the Charleston massacre. And so that summer, when we were doing these interviews in the field, was a racially charged one, in that America was talking. The race was the subtext. And part of the conversation was that the motivation of the shooter was blacks were taking over the world, right? So that the tension and the subtext is also that the side effect of vulnerability and insecurity is, and the way that that Trump and his narratives made it a blame game, we'll make America great again if these other people who are taking away our security are dealt with, right? That's also part of this subtext, but it's really everyone grabbing at straws. One of the things that we don't talk enough about in America is the role of work in structuring our politics, right? So work is stoking a level of racial resentment, and the insecurity of work, right, is stoking a level of racial resentment, because people are like, well, I can't make sense of it, and the thing that's changed is there's more other people here that weren't here before, right? And so I'm gonna make the correlation, right? If there's less of you and more of me, and I can't get the job, that's why, right? And we have a politics that's feeding that kind of narrative. So all of that's happening at the same time as people are trying to figure out, can my family be better? What should I do? Where do I move to? What kind of jobs do I get? Those set of questions and the discomfort that is really, there's no safe place. We used to say, well, just go into tech. Well, now tech's having mass layoffs. So where do you go? Where do you go? That anxiety is what's behind that question.
Yes, in the back.
Oh, you got one? No, good.
Good afternoon, everyone. Anna, I don't know if the data can speak to this, but if it can, I would love to hear you talk about the durability of our conception of the American dream. Yeah. So what I gathered through the talk so far was that regardless if you're black or white, you had an understanding, right, historical understanding of what the American dream is. I think, and you illustrated it so beautifully. I'm wondering if folks are revising that based on their experience, and that's when I say the durability of it. And then, if it is durable in the ways that I might be imagining, how then are folks making sense of that with their lived experience that does not align with that prospect?
That was one of the most fascinating things with the project for us, was you would expect, just for self-preservation purposes, people to be revisionist, right? If I have this aspiration, right, of this house, the white picket fence, and you know the concreteness with which people can define aspiration was hilarious, right? Like it's very fictional, right? Leave it to Beaver-esque, which is why I showed the picture. And so, for a whole lot of reasons, people aren't able to do it, right, and are struggling with that fiction. But rather than saying something's wrong with the aspiration, right, I'm being fed something that's unrealistic given the structures, people internalize failure. And so the persistence and the conception of the dream is really constant. It's really sticky, right? but the critique is not, right? A reviewer earlier in the phase, because we were talking a lot about Americans not seeing structure. And there's a really wonderful book by a sociologist named Alpha Sharon, who talks about the difference between American unemployed workers and Israeli unemployed workers. And that Israeli unemployed workers were able to point to the structure. Well, why didn't the society do this? And why didn't they fix that? And what's the responsibility for that? Like, there was an ability to say, something's wrong with the system, not me. American workers said, it's me, it's me, it's me. If I had done more, if I gotten another education, if I had done right. And so there's that inability to see structure, to name it, is part of that internalization, right? So the dream is sticky. The aspiration is there. The reaching is the thing you must do. The question of why can't I? What happened to the structure of opportunity? Where did the jobs go? Those aren't questions in many ways that we found our participants asking. When we got to the end of, again, these were lengthy interviews, and asked them, what would it look like? Like, imagine for us, what would it look like? It was interesting how much they struggled, because they all fell back on the same thing, meritocracy. Well, again, we talk about meritocracy now, right? And so what would look different in meritocracy? And the Black workers were like, well, yeah, responsibility to actually make meritocracy real.
Go ahead, Peter.
So just a question to draw you out on that exact point. So I was struck by the high levels of belief or affirmation among all participants in meritocracy. And I think the setup for my question is so if you have a sense of self-worth, then and you believe in meritocracy, I think implicitly you believe that the system in which you're showing your merit or not merit is fair, right? And so the fact that the belief in meritocracy was high among a group of people who might have lived experience about the unfairness of it being rather high, and people whose maybe sense of self-worth is validated by not understanding that the system is not fair. Double negative, there, just to make it complicated. Right, so I think, and so there's, and then that seems to be consistent with sort of high levels of optimism on the one side and high levels of pessimism on the other side. So I think a paradox is really interesting psychologically.
Absolutely.
And then that has not just economic consequence, but political.
Oh, absolutely. One of the chapters that we include in the book, one of the reasons this talk was really hard to write, was we make a lot of different arguments in the book. And I was like, well, which one am I going to tell you about, right? Because there's so many. One of the chapters is on unequal opportunity and kind of closed doors and networks. And so on one level, because we got our participants to talk about, well, how do you get jobs? Right? How did you get access to opportunity? And the Black workers were often able to kind of talk about the role of networks and the jobs they missed out on, right? What they had been kept from, and still point to the need for it to be fair, right? And so there was still I know I'm being kept from opportunity, but meritocracy matters. And the thing we talk about in the book, and that's the irony of American opportunity structures, is discrimination is illegal, but nepotism is not. And so when you think about historically who's had access, who had access to opportunity and who was able to, nepotism is not illegal, not. Right? And so if you think about, I'm just sharing opportunities with those who are like me or who have access to my networks, that has a series of consequences that affirmative action can't combat, right? And so there's a series of conversations around how we understand meritocracy, how we understand striving as a concept, at the same time that we have a kind of built-in 400-year head start that you just can't reconcile.
Thank you so much for this, Anna. And I'm wondering if I just want to believe that maybe the younger generations are thinking about meritocracy differently, but I'm just wondering, like, for example, being a millennial, our high school years were defined by 9/11 and war, and then we graduated in 2008 looking for jobs during the recession, then COVID and everything else. Have you spoken to any younger folks who may have a different idea of just that we their ideas are different based on age and the defining events of the generation a little bit more, or are we still stuck in that?
I wish I could be more optimistic.
Right.
So this isn't in my research data, but there was a survey by the trusted source MTV when it was still a more popular thing. But they did a survey of 18 to 24-year-olds around that age in the kind of 2014-ish period, so right around the time of this data. And one of the interesting things is that those young people, black and white, thought that they were more racially progressive than the older generation, right? They were like, we're much more comfortable, like, you know, we're more aware, but that concept stayed at the level of conception of self, right? So when you ask them, how comfortable are you talking about race? Less than 30% were. How comfortable are you dealing with inequality or stereotypes in other groups? Less than 20% were. So in ideas, in exposure, yes, we're more progressive. In dealing with the kind of ugly realities and difficulties, we don't want to talk about it. Right? So what that fuels is an awareness and comfort and reliance and denial as a strategy. Yeah, sorry. I'm really sorry. I don't have a hope. Please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. So one important aspect of your talk was, what is work worth?
Yes.
And the obscene thing that we have is that, you know, people in public transport, in education, in the medical field, they are paid like a fraction of a fraction of work that others paid. So in Europe, there was an initiative in the corporate world that the highest paid person is not allowed to earn 12 times more than the lowest paid person in a corporation. And in Switzerland, it even passed to the public vote. They have a direct democracy, and it failed because they said we wouldn't attract enough talent for our CEOs. But it was a big debate. So my question, or two questions would be, would this be a model that would really shake things up? And on the other hand, if this is not feasible, how can we like reevaluate what work is worth? Because this is really a huge, obscene problem already now.
I love the question and the point to what would it look like? What's the creative push? I had a professor in graduate school who talked about capitalism's werewolf hunger for profit, right? And in America, what we value more than anything else is it being unchecked, right? That's if America had a value system, that'd be it, right? Next to the American dream, the unchecked pursuit of capitalism is the value system. That's the struggle, right? Because it's not that we couldn't do things differently. It's the way that we've structured our systems, and this is why the push to the political will, because the thing about the move from the post-war to the post-industrial labor market is really important to understand. The things that happened in the market didn't just happen, right? There was a set of decisions that were made, a set of policy choices. It didn't just happen. So there are a set of things we could do, right, that we haven't done. So it's about how we understand political will. It's about who we think benefits, even at a simple level, really two concrete things. What it would look like to rebuild the American social safety net. We took it apart on purpose, right, in terms of who we thought it would support, who it was benefiting, what it would look like to motivate workers, right? Because the problem was workers' motivation, right? That was the conception of it. The workers who we chose to leave behind, right? Think about the way that we think about the unemployed in America, right? You haven't been looking for work in more than 2 years, you just drop off the rolls. So we have a kind of artificial sense of who doesn't have a job and who wants one. Think about the way we approach skill in America. Look at the cost of it. So there's a set of, even before we get to the, what some would argue is a socialist position on, earnings constraints. There are things that we can do that have nothing to do with that we in our current political environment can't muster. And if you look at just at some of the simple things, the resistance to the Biden Build Back Better plan, there were a couple of kind of economic baseline things in there that were just like, this would shift child poverty, that we still were like, too far. So that conversation, and part of the aim of this book was to say, let's have a conversation about where Americans really are. Not rhetoric, not extremes. Let's talk about where they really are and what they really want. Americans across both sides of the aisle, there were definitely Republicans in our book, they want the game to be fair, right? They believe in the game of life. They just struggle with why it's not.
Thank you so much for this, and I'm kind of excited. You've written a book capturing voices of some part of Gen X, which I am a proud member of. And I'm wondering, and maybe this isn't a super fair question, but given and I think it kind of builds off the last question a little bit, I'm wondering, if you had to advise like the next person running for president, right? Given where we're at, and where these voices and perspectives are at, are there parts of the social safety net that you think might resonate? And then what would be the narrative, what's the narrative around? Is there a narrative that we need to, so those of us that are thinking about and you just said it, there's evidence-based policies.
Yes.
I mean, the child tax credit, it's kind of like, what? We're not doing that again. I'm just wondering if you have any insight or thoughts late at night about how to what's the narrative that we need to work on shifting? Especially if we're not willing to name things.
Exactly.
I mean,
and part of it is we've got to be able to name it. That the reason we started with the black-white binary, and why we named it kind of work in black and white is it's the reality that's shaping work in America that we try to skirt. Right, it's the reality. It's not playing the race card. The reality of work in America is a black-white story. And so when we try to talk about labor change and not grapple with uneven impacts by race, there's a consequence and a cost to that. The book ends with policy prescriptions, kind of a path for a new America. It's really interesting. But one of the things that I want to take to answer that question is a kind of old story about what happened when we tried to raise employment, deal with unemployment, right? And the kind of battle between economists over whether raising the minimum wage was the right thing to do, right? And so for those of you who don't pay attention to economic history, right, one of the interesting things in that debate was the vote to raise the minimum wage was seen by some economists as choosing to increase unemployment. Right? And so you're like, well, of course, what you want to do is raise the floor. You're going to help some workers do better. And they're like, no, all companies are going to do is slash labor costs. So you just voted to increase unemployment, right? So the point that I want to make is as long as that's the way we understand the conversation, right? As long as there's no checks on the systems that we structured, and we society, political world structures, global economies, we get to create or not checks on systems. But if we don't, then we keep having conversations about, well, if we do this, how are corporations going to get around it? Well, it's going to mean layoffs, or they're going to go multinational, or right? We keep having this thing around how companies move, right? That workers lose in that conversation. So in some ways, the push should be like, how do we have a conversation? And I do think that the way that the current set of policy prescriptions gets around narratives of entitlement, I think we've got to deal with that language, right? Because the thing that is true now and will be true for the foreseeable future in America is for most workers now going forward, it's not a question of will you experience insecurity, it's how often and will you recover? That's the question. And if that's the reality, what are we going to do about it? Because then it's less of you didn't work hard. And the fictional American bubbles that sustained the late 20th century was a bubble, right? You could believe in your little air corner of the world that if you worked hard, things went well. That's not right now. And so I think there's more agita in the system. My hope is that if we're able to have honest conversations with one another, we can build a better version of America. You're welcome. Thank you all so much.
Thank you again, everyone. Thank you for coming.
And there's a reception upstairs, so please let's circulate. And if you've got books, I'd love to sign them.